guys, in this podcast we'll be talking about respiratory systems and their components, or what it takes to make a respiratory system. We'll be talking about respiratory systems in amphibians, mammals, flatworms, insects, and fish. And fish will make a great transition into talking about the countercurrent exchange that happens in their gills. And all of these, we'll be talking about how all of these show evolutionary continuity. And there'll be some connections on a large scale level. So, let's get right into it.
There are a few very simple requirements to making a respiratory system, one being thin membranes filled with blood vessels. Oxygen needs to get into the blood, and therefore, if there are no blood vessels near the O2 diffusion site, it doesn't really help much. Moisture allows for easier diffusion, since moist membranes diffuse better than, say, brick. Large surface area provides a lot of area for the oxygen to pass through, instead of only a little pinpoint, which maximizes the total net gain by the blood. And there's generally a mechanism by which the oxygen is passed by the membrane. Like in fish, water passes by the gills, depositing oxygen again as it passes against the membranes. And in our lungs, we inhale, and as we do, our lungs fill with air, and the O2 diffuses through the side membranes.
So in flatworms, they don't really have a defined respiratory system that they've adapted. Instead, they've developed an integumentary exchange mechanism where oxygen simply diffuses right in to their pores of their body, and the extracellular body fluids that they possess, which kind of represent a circulatory system, kind of transport the, let's say, nutrients and waste and oxygen to the cells in the flatworm, and that's how they survive. So as long as there's an established oxygen gradient between the atmosphere and the flatworm's cells and pores, then there's going to be diffusion whether he's moving around, sitting still.
Insects are very unique in their whole form of breathing. They have a tracheal system, or a network of tubes that run throughout their body around their different organs. And they never really touch, but towards their ends they branch off into individual little tubules that end in tracheoles. These tracheoles are the moist membranes that allow oxygen to diffuse around them. Imagine like a root going underground that sort of spirals off in all these different directions. It provides air to a lot of different locations. They don't really have a central lung per se, but they have openings along their body that different muscles can act as intakes. They pump individually, so each hole can take in however much oxygen it needs, and they're usually located laterally along the insect's body.
Okay, so what makes mammals unique is that they have a lung. The lung functions by way of a diaphragm, which is already illustrated right here, and it contracts and draws oxygen or air from the atmosphere into the lungs by way of a vacuum. In the lungs, there's a complex branching of bronchi and bronchioles to alveoli, which are illustrated here, that have tiny capillaries on them with deoxygenated blood that is to be oxygenated and sent back to the heart in the circulatory system. Now, before it reaches the lungs, the air travels through the nasal passageway where it's the right conditions, the right humidity, and it filters the air of potential toxins, or when we say toxins, we're also talking about any solutes or molecules that wouldn't necessarily be wanting down in the lungs. When we're talking about voluntary and involuntary here, we're talking about breathing. Breathing is a very involuntary action. You do it while you're sleeping. Anything you can do while you're sleeping is considered involuntary. Your heart continues to beat while you're sleeping. Your brain continues to dream and think while you're sleeping. Thinking is an involuntary thing, potentially. And breathing is just the same. However, I can also control my breathing so it is voluntary as well, which makes it very useful for control and to maintain homeostasis in the mammal. When the heart rate goes up, blood starts pumping, you're going to want more oxygen. We can therefore take an action and breathe faster to maintain that equilibrium, that enough oxygen, that homeostasis.
Okay, now amphibians are really cool to me. One of the reasons is, like us, they breathe through lungs. They do it kind of differently, though, in they have to sort of take a breath of air and then swallow the air in order to get it into the lungs. Which, if you try to do that yourself, will just end up either hurting your throat or make you swallow a lot of air and get really, really gassy. Either way, not the best experience ever. But, the other cool thing about them is they can breathe through their skin. It's so thin, generally, that O2 can just diffuse right into the bloodstream, blood vessels, which generally tend to pass close to the skin. And as they do, they can also release CO2 from it. So it's essentially just like breathing through lungs, except out of your skin. And that's something I just find really cool to be able to do, because it means they can stay submerged for quite a long time. And that's why they never really come up on land if they don't have to. Fish are slightly simpler. As we all know, fish have gills, but what do they really do? Well, as the oxygenated water passes through the fish's mouth, it gets filtered over the gills. Now, as it does, it passes through all these gill arches, through the gill filaments, and as that happens, the different filaments absorb all these different O2 molecules, and it diffuses directly into the blood. It also uses a thing called the countercurrent exchange.
Okay, so taking a look at these models for countercurrent exchange. On the right, we have concurrent flow, which is where blood travels in the same direction as the water. This is not as efficient as concurrent flow, where the blood flows in the opposite direction as the water. Why? Well, let's take a look at the illustration that's here. Does the blood ever look like it's reached this deep red, meaning it's great oxygenated? And like this side? No. It's pink, it's purple, mix. Well, the reason being is because the water here that's already traveled through the gills is very, very low oxygen concentration. And as a result, the diffusion that occurs between the blood and the water is very low at this point. Maybe even it's reached equilibrium. But over here, we see a high concentration of O2 here, and a high concentration of O2 here, and a lower concentration of O2 here, and a lower concentration of O2 here. And because the environment has more oxygen in general than the fish's blood, the rate of diffusion is the same at this point. Here, what we see is highly oxygenated blood, very low oxygenated blood, great diffusion, yes, about the same as here, maybe even a little bit better, but it's not equal. The rate of diffusion is not equal once you continue the blood flow and look at it down the line. And because of that, concurrent flow was not adapted or used by fish in their gill system.
Okay, so how in the giant tree of life does one respiratory system, one system in the entire body, show evolutionary continuity? Well, from the simplest things like flatworms, we can see that oxygen is needed to maintain homeostasis. And we also see that thin membranes lubricated with some form of wetness allows for easier diffusion of O2 than a dry surface like, say, human skin. Some animals, like a lot of marine vertebrates, marine invertebrates, use gills, which are simple blood vessel filled things that just sort of catch O2 as it filters by in the water. And if you flip gills on an internal level, it's essentially what we have in our lungs. It's just these blood vessel rich membranes that soak up O2 as we pass it by. In terrestrial animals by inhaling, and in aquatic animals by simply moving. The base thing of all respiration is O2 comes in, CO2 goes out, and we can see that through all forms of life. Nothing breathes CO2 that's an animal. Plenty of plants do, but they unfortunately don't really have a respiratory system that can be studied well. Throughout all branches of life, there's some way to pass this O2. Like, if fish just sort of sat there, they wouldn't get enough O2 that they needed to be active, but they move around, they swim up, down, all around, they get plenty of oxygen. For us, we have a diaphragm which contracts and fills our lungs with air, and things like the frog, they just sort of breathe through their skin and swallow air sometimes. So yeah, it's present throughout all walks of life, no matter where you are.